Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Just over a year ago, we held a discussion about inflation, that distant bogeyman of the 1970s, and asked the question, might it be back to haunt us at some point? 14 months on, there are some very real indicators that it is on the rise. There's a global shipping crisis, labor and supply shortages, and now a very substantial stimulus program unleashed by the United States, all of which point to higher prices. Once again, we have with us the Sunday Times economics editor, David Smith, to explain what's going on. Hello and welcome, David.
Hello, Nicholas. Good to be talking to you.
Yeah, there's a lot to catch up on, and this is a sort of heady time for looking at economics. Let's deal, if we can, with some good news to start with. I remember a year ago when we were having, well, just over a year ago when we were having this conversation, we were talking about a sort of alphabet-style recoveries, and I'm sure you remember the V's, the U's, and the L's. Can you tell us where we are at the moment and what kind of recovery are we seeing?
Yes, the alphabet soup, as you remind me, included the V shape, a quite pronounced and sharp recovery as restrictions were lifted, and you can see the recording again if you like, if it's still available. But I was always a V shaper, but there were alternatives which were W shaped. Second wave knocks us back again, and then it takes time to recover. The U shape, the square root, the saxophone, and all those things. What we've seen mainly for the global economy is a pretty pronounced V-shaped recovery. Really sharp drops in economic activity last year, and particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. I mean, I think two things, followed by sharp recoveries, and those recoveries mean that, for example, China was quite quickly back to pre-pandemic levels. That occurred for them during last year. The US, it happened in the first quarter. Most European countries, including the UK, will do so sometime later this year or early next year. But we'll look back on this, and it will look like a V shape. It will look like a trampoline. Just to say, just before you come in again, the back to the bogeyman is quite a nice way of looking at this, because we've just as of last Sunday, passed the 50th anniversary of what many people would say was the start of the great inflation of the 1970s and 80s. That was when President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of dollars to gold, effectively provoking the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the post-war financial system. And also, only in reading about that did I discover how worried the US authorities were at the time about the emergence of inflation. So, the American government did a very what we might regard as a very un-American thing by imposing a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, various other measures to contain inflation, and of course none of them worked. We tend to think of the inflation of the 70s as only occurring after the Yom Kippur War and after OPEC exerted itself, but the inflationary pressures were building at the end of the 60s, coming through in the early 70s, and then we saw the unleashing of that. In the 1970s, UK inflation got to just under 27% at one point, and then got.
So while you're talking about it, because I'm not an economist and I don't really fully understand all these things anyway. So just what were those? Because I think this is useful to come back to later. There are tons of other things I want to ask you about as we get to the sort of current issues. But what were the primary inflationary factors then? I mean, the demand for increased wages overall. I mean, just run through the.
I think those were the wage price spiral, which happened in a lot of countries, but particularly in the UK, was a factor. But I think that only emerged after inflation had emerged. And once inflation emerged, the unions and wage negotiators elsewhere wanted to keep ahead of it. So that's where you get a wage price spiral. But the inflation of the 70s, the emergence of inflation, was that for a long time, many commodity prices had been suppressed, including the price of oil. The price of oil had not really increased for decades. It was still something under $2 a barrel, something like that. And, commodity producers wanted a bit of the action of a recovering global economy. So the upward pressure on commodity prices began in the late 60s and extended in the 70s. But also, most countries had adopted what you might call, Keynesian fine tuning in the 50s and 60s. And what that meant was, when the economy slowed, you stimulated it a bit with tax cuts or more public spending, and vice versa when it was booming. But all of that was done with most of the eye on unemployment and inflation looking after it itself, and nobody really paid heed to what was happening to the money supply. So the money supply, the explosion of the money supply. Some people, people like in this country, Alan Walters and David Laidler made their names by pointing to the rapid growth of the money supply, the secondary banking crisis in the UK, the emergence of shadow banking in the US, and just that this was leading to an explosion in the money supply, which was bound to give us inflation. So I think that was the cocktail that we had in the 70s. And inflation became a problem in a way that I don't think policymakers had ever anticipated.
That's really a useful lesson. Let's bank that and put that to the side for one moment. Let's look at what the other question I was going to ask you was, so your confidence last year in a V-shaped recovery basically says that you think that the capacity of the economy is going to be hit temporarily. There's not going to be a huge wipeout of many companies. Basically, the sort of broad economic base of most of the global economy is going to be there and is going to revive. So that's what your optimism was based on.
Well, there was a bit of that. I think if I'm very honest about what I thought last year, I probably set it out in the context of two forces operating against one another. On one side, you had the fact that recessions always leave you with spare capacity, and the easiest way of thinking about spare capacity is unemployment. Unemployment, labor, an excess of labor rather than labor shortages. And at the time we were talking last time, there were lots of predictions around that for example, the UK unemployment rate would go to 12 or 14%, which is 4 million plus, something we've never had before, because people couldn't separate the hit to the economy from the hit to the labor market. So then the debate was, how much of that will remain after the economy has recovered, and the jargon name for that, the economic name for that, how much scarring, how much permanent scarring will be left by this pandemic. And some people thought there would be quite a lot. Some people thought there would be quite a little, and quite a relatively small amount. But on the other side, that would be a factor. Spare capacity is a factor holding down inflation. The massive stimulus, monetary stimulus through very low interest rates, huge amounts of quantitative easing, printing money, plus fiscal stimulus, the extent to which governments all over the world responded to the crisis. The biggest responses have been in the US and the UK, but other governments too, and that would be a factor pushing inflation up. So it was a balance between those two. And one of the things I think we've seen, which has been surprising, is that the spare capacity the spare capacity has been used up almost immediately. So you mentioned shortages. We've had figures just today for the UK labour market, which show that the unemployment is a dog that definitely hasn't barked. The unemployment rate helped by some of this fiscal activity, the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, is the unemployment rate is less than 5%. It's not very high anywhere compared with pre-pandemic levels. In the UK, it's a bit higher than it was, but 4.7% compared with predictions of 12 or 14% is very low, and the furlough scheme is being wound down now. Job vacancies are enormous. Job creation is occurring at a very rapid rate. Job vacancies are just short of 1 million in the UK. So never been that high before, and labor shortages are all around us. People will have seen the shortage of HGV drivers. Pretty much every hospitality venue you go into has a notice outside saying staff wanted. So this is the unexpected thing. The economic bounce, the V shape, was predictable as restrictions were lifted, but I think it was quite respectable and normal to expect there would still be a hangover, and the absence of a hangover is one reason that people have got worried about inflation, and in some cases, worried about inflation with numbers to match. The US inflation rate is already 5.4%. The UK inflation is expected by the Bank of England to go up to 4% later this year. So I think the reason for that is that the drag on inflation from spare capacity is just not there to the extent that people thought it would be.
Right. You've answered in a way the question I was going to answer you next, which is what has happened over the last year. But what are the labour market, obviously people being affected by COVID, and we've talked about here in the UK the pingdemic, with people being pinged on their app, and so they can't go into work, and so employers lose employees. But we've seen that around the world, haven't we? And we did this discussion, I think it's about a month ago, on the global supply and shipping crisis. So you've got ports in China that can't be staffed because the staff can't. There's a re-emergence of the pandemic in parts of China, and then at the same time, just in terms of capacity, can you just talk a bit about those two elements, both labour and also supply?
Yeah, very much so. These things where people are forced to self-isolate, and in the case of China that you mentioned, they've taken a very hard line to the authorities there have, when outbreaks have occurred, and there is an outbreak of Delta in part of China at the moment. So they've reimposed lockdowns. The pingdemic was a problem that forced self-isolation, although will become less of a problem now. I think
we're obviously here in the UK, but we've got people in the States,
exactly,
around the world watching. So is a similar thing elsewhere?
There's similar things elsewhere. I mean, just to explain it, for people who are watching elsewhere, we, in the UK, we had the NHS app, and if you were told by the NHS app you've been in close contact with somebody who tested positive, then you had to self-isolate for 10 days, even if you had been double vaccinated. I think circumstances are different in different parts of the country, and some in different countries rather, and some in different states in the US, for example, where the response has been different. But there is no doubt that the continued existence of the virus is a temporary limit on labour supply. But I think in most countries these days, I'll take the UK as an example. The tightness of the labour market looks to go well beyond that. Some of it in the case of the UK is to do with Brexit and the fact that many EU citizens who worked in the UK went back home when the virus emerged, and although some of them have got settlement rights here, many of them have just decided not to come back, and that is a factor behind the shortage of heavy goods vehicle drivers, lorry drivers, truck drivers in this country. But there are other factors as well. I mean, some people seem to have sort of decided that the pandemic was a moment to to reevaluate their lives, and so you've had more young people going into education than was the case before.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So and that is that is the principal reason why what we describe as economic inactivity. I mean, they would say they're perfectly active when they're in education, but they're not working. That's why it's gone up. Older workers who, we had a lot of people staying in work beyond what used to be regarded normal retirement age. A lot of older workers have decided this is the moment to retire. Maybe they don't want to go back to commuting and all those things.
I was looking at the figures. You tweeted them this morning.
Yeah.
It was around 20% of people aged, is it 16 to 64 or 18 to 64 are not economically productive. What's the expression for it?
They're economically inactive. Yeah,
Inactive,
21% or something. Yeah. No, that's that's so there is a legacy there. But I think in the in the wider sense, and what you're talking about, shipping and so on. I mean, you obviously had an expert on recently talking about that. I think when the pandemic first broke and we were first aware of it in China in early 2020, many people thought that was going to be the biggest impact, that suddenly supply chains looked more stretched, looked less reliable, and that businesses maybe had operated on the basis that they didn't really have to worry too much about supply chains. There was a kind of always-on mentality about supply chains. If you wanted something, it was delivered, and it was delivered just in time. And then then people started to look, I think, for temporary reasons why supply chains were suddenly becoming unreliable. So, there was the China thing initially, and then when that moved on, people looked at Suez Canal has been closed for
that huge container
days
ship
it was,
by
by that ship and so on. But something more fundamental is at work here, and it is interesting, that to me that we're used to thinking about service-based activity as dominating economies, certainly advanced economies these days. We're used to technology not requiring, goods or possessions as much as before, but trading goods is still hugely important, and when it is disrupted, it really does disrupt economies quite badly. You see it obviously in the motor industry with chip shortages, but also across the board, and I think your expert probably said that container capacity is not going to get back into some kind of equilibrium until well into next year, and port capacity, some of the temporary problems at ports will resolve themselves, but there is also a question about whether there's been sufficient investment in port capacity over the years, and in shipping capacity generally. So, and the other factor is, of course, that a lot of goods, particularly high value goods, are transported in the holds of passenger aeroplanes. So when we have had restricted passenger flights, I don't know, Heathrow operating at 10% of normal or whatever, you've got less of that happening. So that is, so some of the stuff that would have come in plane holds has been diverted to ships, and that has increased the pressure on shipping capacity. So some of these things are resolved, but they'll take a while to resolve themselves, and these are, again, these are problems we haven't really had to deal with for a very long time. I mean, most of the time when we've been talking about shortages and embargoes, it's all been about whether, the oil the oil producing countries were going to restrict supply, and that was pushing up oil prices, about whether commodities were being restricted for geopolitical reasons, not because supply chains are under such extreme pressure. So that is definitely a factor that has been at work over the past.
And this is significantly new. I mean, I was reading about this, and you might say more about it later. But the technology has obviously been a factor in our lives and increasingly over the last sort of 2 decades that has brought costs down. There's been an enormous enabler. But the other thing that has kept prices low and enabled growth is some growth is shipping costs. And this is with that changing, that must be a big disruptor. And I was reading, this is partly from our last session we did, tenfold increase in shipping prices in some places, $15,800 from China to the west coast of the United States, where it used to be 10 times less. There are 2.4 million container boxes waiting outside ports at the moment. And maritime transport network super stretched, and it's not going to go away well into next year, as you were saying. So that both those technology and shipping have made our lives more efficient, and that's a sort of one unknown. Can we move away from that now and talk about the stimulus package in the United States and what fears that's provoking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things about just on your point there, you can see the effects of some people say, well, when central bankers became the great heroes of the low inflation era, it wasn't them at all. It was all to do with globalization. That suddenly the global labor force, the effective global labor force, just expanded enormously with the opening up of China, the re-emergence of India, the opening up of Eastern Europe, and following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union and so on. So suddenly you had this big increase in labor supply, not necessarily coming to countries, although some came to countries like the UK, but just being available as low-cost locations in a way that they had not before. So those are, so globalization was definitely and all the things you speak of to do with transportation, international telecommunications costs coming down very rapidly, which enabled the effective transfer of a lot of operations to countries like India, call centers and all those things. Now, when you take that away, two things happen. One is that what you're mainly talking about, if these container costs are going to stay at the levels to which they've risen, that is an addition to costs. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the inflation is going to be permanently higher. It's a one-off level effect, unless they increase tenfold every year. You don't have to worry about that as a permanent. But but it also means that the economic arguments for locating production in countries like China do become diminished. They're diminished for two reasons. One is that labor costs have been going up, wages and labor costs have been going up in those countries. The other is it costs more to ship to the West. So we may be seeing, people talk about deglobalization usually for political reasons, the Trump tariffs and things like that. But there is also an economic argument, and a climate change argument, which may mean that countries want to locate production closer to home, and the supply chain difficulties will have added to that. And so, we may be, in an era where the anti-inflation benefits of globalization have come to an end, or at least are more limited than they were. Now, sorry for the diversion, but on to the stimulus package. It's very curious when you look at this, in the sense that the stimulus package in the US, and you can add it up to something like $6 trillion, which is an enormous amount. You always have to look at the fine print of American stimulus packages. I mean, sometimes they include stuff that they've already done during the pandemic. There's often a battle to get things through Congress, a lot of pork barrel politics involved in that. But this is a curious thing to do in many ways when you have already got a very rapidly recovering economy. The US is adding hundreds of thousands of jobs every month at the moment as it recovers from the pandemic. Unemployment did go up initially quite high there because they didn't introduce anything like the furlough scheme. So they did have their 14% unemployment, but it's come down very rapidly, and the monthly job numbers are very strong. So why do you need to do that? You know, and why do you need to pump in 6 trillion to an already recovering economy? You know, pumping in a lot of money, in introducing a big fiscal stimulus, is something that you do when an economy is depressed and needs the hand of government to lift it out of that. Not when it's growing pretty rapidly as it is. I mean, the US economy will grow by around 7% this year, which is not the time to introduce a $6 trillion stimulus. So
the Fed would seem to think that that this current inflation rise, which is already creeping in there, is a temporary thing.
Well, it doesn't, I think. I mean, the great word from central banks is to describe, inflation rises as transitory or temporary. Transitory is their language. Temporary is the word that most of us would use. And I think what they mean by that is that inflation won't stay at between 5 and 6% forever. It will come back down again. But I think alongside there is a question of what they regard the US authorities, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and of course the Treasury is run by Janet Yellen, a former Federal Reserve chairman. You know, she was sacked by Donald Trump, but she knows monetary policy inside out. And I think the view that a lot of people have looking at the US is that America is prepared to run the economy hot and to allow, not the 15% inflation that they had in 1983 or the 12% that they had in the mid 70s, but to allow inflation to run, 3 or 4% for the next few years as the price of getting a really rapidly growing economy. I mean, they see, I think, the stimulus, not perhaps the lesson of the pandemic, of the vulnerability of the pandemic, as a chance to sort of try and shake America into permanently stronger growth. And if higher inflation is a price you have to pay for that, as long as it can be held to 3 or 4%, that is a price worth paying.
I guess there are lots of questions about how you do it, and I want to come to that in just a second. Let's get some questions, everyone. If you can start putting your questions in the Q&A box below there, that would be great. And there are many of you out there who are more qualified than I am to ask these questions, so please do go ahead. The thing you pointed out in your article about the V-shaped recovery in the UK is that manufacturing capacity has basically been flatlined. And if you go back to that conversation about repatriating manufacturing capacity or producing more productive economies, surely it matters if you're going to chuck all this money in the economy, what are you spending it on and what impact does it have in the longer term?
Yes, it does. Yeah, and I think this has been a long. If you look back, at the very recent history.
I'm going to chuck into that as there's the three words: secular stagnation hypothesis, and how that relates to it.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Let me start with manufacturing. I'll come on to secular stagnation. If you look at the recent history of manufacturing, then manufacturing industry was much less affected by restrictions, lockdowns, than, for example, physical retailing and hospitality, and all those service sectors which required people to gather together, entertainment and all those things. So manufacturing in most countries was required to introduce, factories were required to introduce safety procedures, but not required to shut down. Including in the UK, even in the first lockdown, the strictest lockdown, there was no requirement the factories had to close, merely that they have to introduce some social distancing. And then, as 2020 went on, manufacturing recovered quite rapidly, but since when it's, as you say, it has flatlined. And that is the story of UK manufacturing over quite a long time period. That there have been fits and starts. George Osborne, our former Chancellor, talked about the march of the makers in 2012, and how manufacturing was going to do wonderfully well, and it never did. And all of that has been kind of exacerbated by Brexit. Brexit has raised questions about, if you're no longer in the single market, whether you want manufacturing capacity in the UK. A lot of inward investment in the UK was to build manufacturing capacity that would, service the European market. So quite a few, issues there in terms of that. And secular stagnation and manufacturing are not the same thing. Secular stagnation means essentially, and it was a phrase revived by Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary, who is, in fact, one of the critics of the Biden stimulus, because he thinks it will be inflationary. But you would have thought that, for someone like him, a Keynesian economist, that this was what the US is trying to do, as I hinted, was to shake the economy out of the low growth it's had. In the case of the US, the UK has had very weak growth since the financial crisis. Stagnant productivity and average economic growth, at least, well, on average, about a percentage point less than was the norm before the financial crisis. And when I tell you, percentage point doesn't sound very much, but the difference between 2.5% and 1.5% is quite important. We've only been growing at 60% of the previous rate of growth. So that is a kind of secular stagnation. So I think the debate about this is whether this crisis we've been through is an opportunity for as the US is trying to do, shake us out of that secular stagnation, even at the expense of a bit more inflation, or whether we settle down to something which is still pretty subdued and still, and still not particularly remarkable, and is lower than we've been used to for most of the period since the Second World War. So I think that is where the debate is. The US is doing something very different from most other countries. Most other countries have adopted the same response in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of intervention as they did during the financial crisis, which is intervene during the crisis, pump money in during the crisis, rein back after it. The US pumped in during the crisis and is pumping in again during the recovery. So it's an experiment that we're seeing from the US, and you could see it as an experiment which is to lift us out of secular stagnation, or to lift the US out of secular stagnation.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a second. Simon Jackson, we've got for our first question. Go ahead, Simon.
Post-Brexit, we having all got very used to the import of labour. By what mechanism are we going to address the labour shortage? And as a follow-on question, is this exacerbated by COVID, or was this always going to be a problem? Yet another one of which we weren't quite praised when making our decision.
Yeah, and just to add to Simon's question, David, can we just all talk very briefly about the exports and imports from the EU, because the statistics are now coming through and they're markedly different from what they used to be.
Yes. On your points, Simon, I think it was inevitable that we would be. I think as I was saying, COVID has exacerbated the shortage of EU workers, because I think it provided an additional reason for EU workers who are in the UK to return home when it emerged. Not least because it emerged with the exception of Italy, the UK had a bigger COVID problem, certainly early on, and probably still, than most other countries, and we had the restrictions and so on. And I don't think, I think most, EU workers could have been put on furlough, but I think many of them decided to go home. And there were always three reasons why EU workers would return to their own countries, even apart from COVID. I mean, one was that they didn't feel so welcome here, from parts of the population, and the Brexit vote was in some ways, a direct snub to them. Second reason was that the path to citizenship was seen as much more difficult, and the idea of permanently settling somewhere where you had to go through a settlement scheme with a possibility of citizenship at the end of it was more difficult. But the other reason, and certainly for some of the places where we attracted a lot of labour from, like Poland, suddenly their economies started to do a lot better, and so there was a good reason for returning home, because they could work profitably, and some of the big differences in wage levels started to be reduced as well. So I think all those things were inevitable, and some of those things were happening. I mean, long before COVID emerged, the net migration position for so-called EU8 migrants, and those are the ones from the Eastern European countries that joined in 2004, so not including Romania and Bulgaria, and that had reversed. So they were, having attracted a lot in since 2004, there was net outward migration for them, even before COVID, partly because they could return home and be employed, profitably. They could do it there. So I think it was inevitable, and one of the things I tried to say before the referendum was that. The idea that UK workers, UK nationals were being priced or being kept out of work by this, by immigration from Eastern Europe of workers was just a fiction. We saw the rise in the employment rate for UK nationals increased in line with the increase in migrant workers. They were an addition rather than a substitution. So I think people got it wrong for all sorts of reasons on that. And so the shortages were inevitable. They're there in a lot of jobs, which, it is not, if people want to be an HGV driver, it's not that difficult to become one. I think an intensive course takes about 3 months, and you could probably find plenty of people to sponsor you for it. But that many hospitality jobs, many other jobs were not ones that, that necessarily that UK workers, UK young people wanted to do. And so I think that is why you've always, that is why the labour shortages have been intense and remain intense, in agriculture, in hospitality, and in quite a lot of other sectors as well. So it was always going to happen. Some of us warned about it.
But David, Simon's question is, how's it going to be fixed, and where do you see the fixes coming from? I don't want to go down the sort of the Brexit quite too long.
Thanks for pulling me up on that. No, I think it's going to be fixed by the government. We see it as being fixed by persuading more people, particularly young people, into vocational education, into the idea that a job in the construction industry is a good job to have, and that qualification is a good job to have. But governments have been trying to do that for decades, and it's quite difficult to make it work. And as I said earlier, at the moment, what is happening is that more young people are opting for education, but they're not opting for vocational education.
All that points to higher wages, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. But the other thing, I think, which is what a lot of employers would think was inevitable is that the government is going to have to relax its rules, its constraints on migrant workers and the conditions that migrant workers have to fulfill, which actually were relaxed. You know, there was a point in which, you know, you couldn't bring in an outside worker unless the salary was 35,000 a year. They've reduced that, but I think a lot of employers are pushing quite hard for a further relaxation. And you know, as far as I can see, you know, nobody should really have the Brexit argument was always about, you know, people shouldn't have the automatic right to come, you know, but you know, if you can still have rules, you can just change those rules, you know. So what was your point, Nicholas? You had an additional point.
The additional thing was about trade and exports with the labor is part of it, but we're seeing, I mean, your article from yesterday, you talk about the 14.5% lower exports compared to 2019, even though we've had a good economic recovery, a V-shaped recovery, and imports from the EU down 23%. So, you could talk about that sort of freeze around January, February, when people had obviously stocked up on things before the change came into effect at the beginning of the year. But clearly that Brexit has had a big impact on trade.
Yeah, no, it has, and that is, you know, that is going to be a long-term impact, I think. And the reason for that is it goes beyond the problems that people had at the start of the year. It is just that there is just an enormous amount more red tape and regulation involved in exporting and importing, and it means that, you know, a lot of smaller companies have given up on the EU market completely. You know, it was an easy one for them, and now it's a difficult one, and vice versa. You know, a lot of European businesses have stopped supplying to the UK, and you know, and that's within that 23% drop. You know, that is reflected in some of the very real shortages that you see, you know, all around at the moment, shortages of building materials, shortages of some products on supermarket shelves and so on, because, you know, it is more difficult. You know, it was never as frictionless as people thought it was. You know, if you've ever been through, through Calais to Folkestone, you know, it's not a question of just driving onto
the point you're making is that we've talked about the global supply shortages. We've talked about shipping problems, but this is very clearly between the EU and the UK. This is distinct from that.
It is distinct from that, and it is distinct from the performance of UK imports and exporters, UK imports and exports. When we look at the non-EU trade, you know, there's a clear EU difference there.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Let's bring in a question from Ruth Campbell. Go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you. My question perhaps is political as much as economic, but you commented on the fact that the American stimulus approach is very different from other Western economies. How much do you think that is affected by or in response to this China policy or the threat of China?
I've lost. Can you see me still?
Yeah, we can see you clearly. You're fine. You're fine.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see you at the moment. I don't know what I've done, but I'll try and rectify that. Now, Ruth, it's a good point. I mean, I think and we've seen that before from America, that you know, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, in 2001, you know, the US was very keen not to allow Al Qaeda a victory in terms of its effect on the US economy. So that was why you saw, you know, at that time Alan Greenspan running the US economy very hot, and you know, contributing to many of the problems that we saw when in the financial crisis. So I think all those things are have been important, and it's and I think it's a good point. You know, it's one that that hadn't occurred to me, but I think it's a very fair point. Still trying to get you.
But in terms of I'm just trying to think of how if you're Keynesian, but also you're looking more at the sort of in involvement in infrastructure spending. This is more like running a command economy, and China does incentivize sectors of its economy. I mean, is there sort of temptation to see it as specific as that?
Yeah, I think you know, in the case of yeah, I mean, if you are competing with China, and it is interesting that you know, the Biden administration, just as it has proved in the case of Afghanistan and the withdrawal, it's more it's more Trump-like than you might expect, and that they haven't relaxed any of the tariffs on when it comes to trade with China, and they still, if anything, the attitude of the Biden administration is to see the competitive threat from China as as even more intense than the Trump administration did. Now, I think in the case of Trump, it was a battle he wanted to fight. I think the Democrats have always been instinctively slightly more protectionist, and they listen to all those Washington think tanks which take the threat from China very seriously. So I think all those things add up. I don't think America is suddenly going to become a state aid economy, but I think they're certainly fighting against the idea that it is automatic that China becomes the world's biggest economy over the next few years. Which many people, starting with those original Goldman Sachs BRICS projections, that was what people thought would happen. So I think they are certainly fighting against that idea. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting point, Ruth. Yeah.
I was thinking of one example is that the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation has been paid $50 billion to create a new semiconductor facility in Texas because the US has lost the capacity to produce the latest semiconductors. So that's perhaps that mirrors Chinese intervention. We've got a question from Andy Mendes, which I'm going to follow up on. Go on, Andy. Andy, you there? You need to open your microphone up, probably on the bottom left of your screen. While Andy sorts out his microphone issues, and Andy, just chip in as soon as you can. If we're talking about sort of longer term threats from inflation, what is greenflation, David? What's greenflation?
Yeah, well, we it's not an expression I use very often, and but I may have to now you've introduced it in the conversation. I think what we're looking at there, and it's a real dilemma for governments. It's a particular dilemma for the UK government at the moment because we're hosting the COP26 conference in.
Can you define what it is? What does greenflation mean?
Well, it's it is the cost of going net zero, and the cost of going net zero is, for example, is are low emission or zero emission energies going to be more expensive than gas and so on. And you can see though, you can see straightforward examples of that in the kind of things we look at. I've been following this debate in letters pages and so on over heat pumps with interest because UK government policy is to replace in homes gas boilers with natural gas boilers with heat pumps. Heat pumps cost 5 or 6 times as much, and according to some of the correspondence I've seen in the letters pages, you do need a conventional boiler as well for the times when the heat pump can't provide you with enough heat. So it's an interesting one. It's potentially more costly to the consumer or to governments. Governments face a dilemma over what they do, for example, with the taxes that they currently levy on fuels. Petrol and diesel. Do you transfer that levy over to electric vehicles, which then reduces the incentive for people to acquire electric vehicles? So
but David, I think the broader sense of the question is that if we've been living this disinflationary environment for the past 40 years, things are beginning to change. So you talked about domestic, in terms of pressures on households, we all have to spend a lot more money on changing our heating. It's twofold. It's both the cost of things, which have become more and more expensive because of the deliberate costs to carbon-orientated industries. So you've got two things pushing those prices up.
Yes, you have, but I think a lot of people who advocate action in this area would also say there are a lot of benefits, including employment benefits, from a kind of green agenda and a Green New Deal and so on. It's one of those things where if you'd said to it's a question of what you spend on and what your priorities are on. If you'd said to people in the early part of the 20th century in the UK, there will come a time, at the moment, your government spends 10% of GDP. There will come a time when it is normal for them to spend 40%, and your taxes will go up in parallel with that. Your reaction might be, well, I'm going to be very poor, but in fact, that has occurred over a period when we've all got a lot better off in general. Living standards have risen, and you can sketch out the same kind of scenario when it comes to being greener. It's just we've had to change the priorities of the things we spend on. I'm sure that will be mortgages available for heat pumps for people who need them and so on. But just as we become more prosperous, we want better healthcare, and we're prepared to pay more taxes for that. Maybe we'll want a greener economy. We'll be prepared to pay more taxes from that. But this is not a static situation where you have to be worse off as a consequence. It is one that unfolds over a number of years, and need not be there need not be spectacular greenflation. That would only happen if you do something very quickly, and that's that then becomes a problem. If these things are rolled out over time, if they can be rolled out over time, then I don't think we should be necessarily too pessimistic about that.
Andy Mendes has finally sorted out his microphone problem, but I feel that we may have robbed him of his question. So either a comment or maybe an additional question, Andy.
Well, I can't, Nicholas, thank you. I forgot to plug myself in, which is always difficult. David's comments depressed me really, because I remember exactly the same comment he might have made 5 or 10 years ago about the enormous cost of wind power or of solar panels or whatever it is compared with this wonderful coal stuff. But it seems to me that the point he's missing is we don't really have a choice. And so we've moved, the science has moved beyond, wouldn't it be nice if we did a bit of green stuff, but of course inflation might catch us out. But so I guess my follow-up question is, do you believe, unlike me, that the American government, the British government, let alone the Chinese government, is actually seriously going to do anything about this? Or should I be buying my baling equipment now?
Thank you. No, I wasn't, Andy. I wasn't suggesting that this is just a nice little luxury to have. I do believe we have to do it. But you raise the key question. I think the key question in terms of the politics here is always going to be the China and to a certain extent the America question. Why should we be doing this when they are not? And even on the admitted net zero target for China. It's later than the UK's is or the West's is. And I think the other point is that, I've been very struck by the timidity of this government and to a certain extent its predecessors to do anything that is unpopular, and that applies to those other countries as well. It should be easier for China because they can force these things through, but the more easily. But you look at the example I always come back to on this is the easiest one of the most straightforward green policies to have was the one that Gordon Brown introduced as Chancellor very many years ago, which was to over-index fuel duties. So instead of going up just in line with inflation, fuel duties in every budget went up by 5% more than inflation, and the consequence would have been over years that the petrol and diesel would have become much more expensive. Then we had fuel protests in the UK, and that policy of over-indexation was abandoned. And for the past 10 years, even indexation has been abandoned. And so because it's every time it is threatened, the Tory backbenchers kick up a fuss, and it is not done. So there's no doubt that the current Chancellor wanted to do it in his budget in March, but was prevented from doing so. And that that's a small thing. You think of some of the bigger things that are needed, and I agree with you, are essential to respond to climate change. And then I just have my worries about the political will, whether it is there for those kind of things to be ever implemented.
I do want to get a couple of follow-up questions, and from people who, as I say, have got more better economic minds or financial minds than I have. So I'm going to come back to Simon Jackson in a second. So you talked about that sort of timidity that the British government. I'm just thinking if you are spending lots of money on building back better, where's that money going to at the moment? Well, I'm talking about the UK at the moment, but this seems to be in vogue. A more interventionist economic policy.
Yeah, I mean in the case of the US, the part of the stimulus package is $2 trillion on infrastructure, or up to $2 trillion on infrastructure, and and part of the reason the Biden administration is very keen to do that is because that was one of the ambitions of Trump, which he never delivered on, and that was all about dilapidated roads that need interstate highways that needed resurfacing and repair, bridges that needed replacing, airports, regional airports that were in terrible condition, all those things. I think and the UK has got its own infrastructure program running at the moment, which is part of the Building Back Better, leveling up agenda. The problem is that there are some examples. You take the northeast of England. The poster child for this government is the Tees Valley in the northeast. The area around Darlington, Middlesbrough, places like that. And the aim there is to have quite a lot of green activity, carbon capture and storage, wind turbine construction, all those things, as part of a leveling up agenda. But a lot of things that people expect and want, whether it's high-speed railways or better roads, are still to do with, the old carbon economy. So I think, the green agenda features, but it doesn't feature as much as you might expect from a government which is supposedly committed to that.
So we need to wrap it up now. But if I was to say to you, look, it seems to me you're saying, look, there are going to be higher prices. There is going to be a marginally higher inflation, but it's not going to be overly dramatic. And it's something we can live with for a while.
I think that's certainly the case in the US for its own special reasons. I suspect in the, here in the UK, we'll get to 4% by the end of the year. Then, what economists call base effects, comparisons with a year ago, drop out, and then we come back quite quickly to 2% or so, maybe a bit above, but not much. So I don't think this is, you know, Richard Nixon and the 1970s all over again. I don't think we're going to see those kind of inflation rates, but I think it will be a little bit higher, as you say, than we're used to, particularly in America.
David Smith, thank you very much indeed. It's been brilliant. Do stay on the line, everybody else, if you've got any thoughts to add afterwards. My thanks again to David Smith, the Sunday Times economics editor.